Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us here today and for this whole week. It has been an honor being in attendance and being able to hear some of your stories, some of your hopes, and some of your needs. So I want to thank you very much for sharing that and for engaging in these important conversations so that we can listen. We're here today to talk about several programs at EPA to address emerging contaminants in our region. If anything we say catches your interest, I would love to speak more about these programs with you, and we can continue those important conversations. As a general overview, today we'll discuss the Clean Water Emerging Contaminant Funding Program, the two Drinking Water Emerging Contaminant Funding Programs, and speak a bit about some PFAS efforts and resources. Before we do, I will pass the microphone around so folks have an opportunity to introduce themselves. And I'll note that we'll have a question or a moment for all questions at the end of all three sections. I'll start the introductions while I have the microphone. I'm listed in the middle of this slide. My name is Sarah McGilloway. I use any pronouns, and I'm here today to tell you about the Drinking Water Emerging Contaminant Funding Programs. And I will pass the microphone to my colleagues who will speak about PFAS later in this talk.
Hi, everyone. My name's Ian Chin. I work on implementing the Safe Drinking Water Act for tribes, and I also work on our PFAS Drinking Water Sampling Program with Joy.
Hi, I'm Joy Ketterer, and I'll be speaking with Ian today on the new PFAS rule, as well as our Region 9 PFAS Sampling Program.
Hi, I'm Madeline Tango. I work in the tribal infrastructure section, but also help develop the PFAS fact sheet, which I'll be presenting on as well.
Hey everyone, my name is Amita Murali-Duran, and I'm a project officer in the tribal infrastructure section, working mainly with tribes in Central and Northern California, and I'm also one of the co-coordinators for the Clean Water Indian Set-Aside Emerging Contaminant Program, which we'll be talking about now. So this program is the last and newest of our bill programs that will help fund projects to address emerging contaminants in clean water. And so this is referring mainly to projects addressing wastewater and stormwater. And I, along with Nancy Sakabason, are your program coordinators. So if you have any questions regarding this program, feel free to reach out to us. So a little bit of background information about this program. We acknowledge that information about the presence and extent of emerging contaminants in wastewater might be limited for tribes. And we also recognize that the Indian Health Service Sanitation Deficiency System hasn't previously focused on ECs in wastewater. And so because of that, eligible projects for Clean Water Indian Set-Aside Emerging Contaminant funding are not required to be in the IHS SDS list. With this program, we are encouraging tribes to focus on identification of ECs and supporting preliminary engineering activities that will lead to well-scoped and ready-to-fund projects in future fiscal years of the Clean Water Indian Set-Aside program. And we are currently accepting project proposals and will continue to do so on a rolling basis. We're going to be rolling out our next solicitation with updated guidelines once our consultation period concludes, but we are currently accepting proposals. And currently we have $3.8 million available in funding, and we anticipate receiving up to $1.6 million each year through fiscal year 26 in Region 9. So we wanted to provide a definition of what a clean water EC is. The definition for clean water ECs is much broader than that of drinking water emerging contaminants. For drinking water ECs, they must be on the current contaminant candidate list, whereas for clean water ECs, the requirement is that they do not have established water quality criteria under EPA's Clean Water Act, Section 304A. The exception to this is PFAS, which is eligible for funding under this program. And other contaminants that are not eligible for funding are nutrients like ammonia, nitrogen, and phosphorus, certain organics, and certain metals. And some contaminants that are eligible that tribes have previously expressed interest in addressing through this program include 6-PPD quinone, PFAS, like I mentioned earlier, pharmaceuticals and personal care products, cyanotoxins, microplastics, and nanomaterials. For funding eligibility, federally recognized tribes are eligible for funding, and for project eligibility, projects must meet these 3 requirements. They must be eligible under Section 603C of the Clean Water Act, which allows for a broad range of project types because there are 11 eligibilities, some of which include construction of publicly owned treatment works, wastewater reuse and recycling, stormwater projects, and non-point source pollution projects. The other 2 requirements are that they must address 1 or more ECs and they must result in a water quality benefit. And what we mean by that is that the project must relate to some sort of infrastructure fix further down the line. And once again, we wanted to reiterate that projects are not required to be identified in the IHS SDS system. So this is a non-exhaustive list of the potential projects that would be eligible for funding under this program. And we want to highlight that EC identification is an eligible use of this funding. And so if you suspect that there is a clean water EC present in your water, sampling for that is an eligible use and an eligible project type. Moving on, we wanted to highlight EPA-directed in-kind assistance as a resource through this program. So funding can be awarded through direct grants to tribes and interagency agreements with IHS as that's appropriate through all of our funding programs, but EPA-directed in-kind assistance is a new resource that we hope to leverage through this program. This would be most suitable for certain projects like emerging contaminant sampling and PER, or preliminary engineering report development, and it would offer tribes more flexibility and reduce administrative requirements since EPA would be coordinating much of those efforts. And tribes may request a combination of grant funding and in-kind assistance to carry out a project, and so this can provide tribes with a capacity building opportunity where EPA-directed in-kind assistance can provide additional targeted support where it's needed. We noted during our early engagement and consultation periods that there was an interest in assistance with co-op development and assistance with sampling efforts. So this is something that we can provide assistance with through these in-kind services. We can assist with individual sampling efforts, which includes tasks like I mentioned earlier, co-op development, sample collection and lab analysis, as well as community engagement and training to support subsequent monitoring after initial monitoring efforts. And I wanted to talk a little bit about one of the project proposals we received that we will be funding. A tribe came in for funding for a sampling effort to identify cyanotoxins in their surface water and PFAS in their wastewater. So cyanotoxins and PFAS are eligible clean water ECs. Sampling is an eligible project type, and the project will result in a water quality benefit since the sampling program will inform future infrastructure fixes to remove those contaminants. And these funds are going to be awarded through a combination of a direct grant to the tribe and EPA-directed in-kind services. The in-kind services will include assistance with co-op development and lab analysis, and it'll specifically include lab training for personnel to perform lab analysis after the initial sampling effort is completed. And this project is intended to kickstart a long-term sampling program and inform future infrastructure projects targeting the removal of cyanotoxins and PFAS. And this is the type of project that we generally expect to see in Region 9, that is investigatory and planning projects that will later be ready for construction and funding from other sources, although we can still fund construction projects if they're ready for that. And that's it from me, but I wanted to plug our website, so feel free to scan the QR code, and there you'll find mine and Nancy's contact information, as well as the contact information of your project officers who may be able to assist you with more specific project needs. Thank you.
Thank you, Mita. Again, I'm here to talk to you guys about the 2 drinking water emerging contaminant funding programs. There are fact sheets for the drinking water program and actually for the clean water program as well that Amita was just sharing about on this front table here. So I'd encourage you to take a look if anything sounds interesting. I'm excited to be speaking to you about these programs today. It's a good time to be hearing this talk. And that's because applications for the fiscal year 25 cycle are going to be due on December 6th, so it's upcoming. Through the same process that's described in our program guidance that my colleague Nancy Sakabason recently sent out. But for these 2 funding programs, I would also just like to let you know we will continue accepting applications until the funds are fully depleted. So if it doesn't seem reasonable for your utility to make that deadline, I'd still highly encourage you to apply. EPA still has sufficient funds for these opportunities from previous years, so there's a lot of funding to be allocated. While there are two drinking water funding programs, I'll also note that both of them have the same simplified application process. So when you're applying, you don't really need to know which of these programs you're interested in. You would just simply send us a tribal endorsement letter, a 2-page proposal PDF, and documentation of an emerging contaminant, and of course, for any construction project, a preliminary engineering report. With that information, we can select either of these funding opportunities that will work best for your program in the most competitive way. If your tribe would like to apply for any drinking water emerging contaminant funds, please reach out to me so we can coordinate putting together these components, and I can answer any questions you may have. We're several years into implementing our two programs, which address emerging contaminants in drinking water. Through these programs, funds can be awarded as either grants or interagency agreements with IHS. If you're interested to know their names, one of these programs is the Drinking Water Tribal Set-Aside Emerging Contaminants Program, which we abbreviate to DWTSA-EC. The other is the Emerging Contaminants in Small or Disadvantaged Communities Grant, which we abbreviate to ECSDC. The programs do have similar eligibilities and can fund similar types of projects. A project must be otherwise drinking water tribal set-aside eligible, meaning that these requirements are listed on page 12 of our guidance, but meaning essentially the project must serve a public water system with at least one tribal home on the system, be in compliance, and have properly certified operators for any construction projects. These two funding programs do emphasize addressing PFAS analytes in drinking water. However, projects that address any contaminant on any of EPA's contaminant candidate lists, or CCLs, are eligible for these funding opportunities. Manganese and cyanotoxins are two examples of contaminants on that list that we funded in the region. We'll talk about those in a moment. And I'll let you know our fiscal year 25 guidance does have a comprehensive list of all these contaminants on the CCL. There are over 220 compounds on that list. When you take a look, you'll see many of those contaminants have names you might be familiar with. Many of them, probably not. There are contaminants associated with pesticides, herbicides, some naturally occurring due to the geology of the area, some associated with the production of consumer goods, some associated with just the existence of consumer goods. If you have any questions about any of those compounds, please reach out to me. I would be absolutely happy to help your water system identify which compounds may be of concern for your unique area, based on land use, based on geology. I hope you guys can consider me a resource. With so many eligible contaminants and with the funding pool available, EPA has a tremendous opportunity to fund many projects. The Drinking Water Tribal Set-Aside EC funding pools had $6.2 million allocated to Region 9 in fiscal year 24. And the EC SDC had $7 million allocated for fiscal year 24, for a combined just under $14 million in funding to address emerging contaminants in drinking water. Note that's from just the past year alone, and as I stated previously, there are still funds remaining from fiscal years 22 and 23 as well. For these opportunities, there are no cost share requirements unless otherwise stated in the base guidance, like for commercial enterprises. There's no underserved community requirement for either. One notable difference between these two is that for the ECSDC, programs or projects rather must be serving a small community. That's therein defined as a community with less than 10,000 individuals population. That is just for the water system, so that's not the tribal population. All to say, EPA offers many resources, and we'd love to allocate these resources to support your critical projects. There are many different types of projects that one could fund under these programs. Some examples include completing pre-development activities, such as determining if and where contamination exists, conducting initial monitoring to establish a baseline understanding, developing project planning and preliminary engineering documents, designing projects, technical assistance to evaluate emerging contaminant problems, programs to provide household water quality testing, including testing for unregulated contaminants, and activities necessary and appropriate for tribes to respond to an emerging contaminant. In addition, the ECSDC, so that one serving populations of 10,000 or less, can also fund laboratory testing equipment, such as supplying water test kits and instructions to households, source water protection activities, which is fairly unique, and an interim solution like reverse osmosis or point-of-use filters, but not bottled water. This list is an example of some, but not all, projects which can be funded, and you can refer to our guidance for more information. There are some contaminants that have already been identified or addressed by tribal utilities in Region 9 with these funding pools. And you may consider if these issues are also affecting your water system. We're going to take a focused look at some of these contaminants. I'll introduce the first two now before handing the talk over to my colleagues to take a closer look at the third. EPA has funded projects which address manganese in the region. Manganese is a naturally occurring contaminant throughout the whole continent, but contamination is most common within alluvial plains like in Central California, Northern Nevada, and along the Colorado River Basin. Manganese contamination often co-occurs with iron and can occur in either groundwater or surface water. Manganese can build up in pipes and can make water appear black. Consumers may report an oily smell or something that looks like coffee grounds coming out of their lines. There are various potential effects of manganese contamination depending on the quantity of manganese and its placement in the distribution system. In some cases, it can cause operational issues in the water system and can build up and affect pipe pressure. Manganese is regulated by a secondary maximum contaminant level of 0.05 milligrams per liter. And the secondary standard was established primarily to address aesthetic issues in the line, and manganese can affect the color, taste, and odor of water. Some research does show that manganese contamination can have harmful effects on infants and young children. So EPA has established a lifetime health advisory level of 0.3 milligrams per liter, which means adverse health effects are not expected below this level. EPA has already funded a project to perform ice pigging to remove manganese buildup in a tribal utilities distribution lines. That's what's pictured here. This photo is showing what came out of the lines after this treatment. We have also, and more typically, funded projects to remove manganese at the entry point via the installation of centralized treatment. If you think manganese is affecting your system, I'd encourage you to apply or reach out. Like I said before, I'm happy to help you take a look at your application. The second contaminant I'll be telling you about is cyanotoxins. Cyanotoxins are released from harmful algal blooms. Algae can overproduce in certain systems and leach these contaminants into the water. EPA has provided funding to develop a PER to investigate treatment alternatives to remove cyanotoxins from a tribal utilities water supply. Cyanotoxins from harmful algal blooms can occur in systems that rely on surface water. They may spike seasonally, so they may not always present while one person is out testing for them. But not all algal blooms do produce cyanotoxins. The most common cyanotoxins are microcystins, cylindrospermopsin, anatoxins, and saxitoxins. And cylindrospermopsin has a drinking water health advisory of 0.7 micrograms per liter for infants and young children, and of 3 micrograms per liter for school-aged children and adults. In contrast, microcystins have a drinking water health advisory of 0.3 micrograms per liter for infants and young children, and of 1.6 micrograms per liter for children and adults. If you do have a surface water-fed drinking water system and have concerns that cyanotoxins may be affecting it, I would encourage you to reach out and we can talk about applying for funding. While manganese and cyanotoxin projects have been funded in this region, I would like to emphasize that the contaminants that rank the highest in this funding pool are PFAS. Particularly as the new PFAS rule is implemented, we expect to award more funding for PFAS projects in the coming years. As your utility begins sampling, know that this resource is available to address any PFAS treatment projects and planning projects that you may be interested in funding. I will hand over my mic to my colleagues now to take a deeper dive into PFAS resources. But please do reach out with any drinking water emerging contaminant questions. I would be so happy to speak with you. Let's get these projects funded. Here's Joy.
Thanks, Sarah.
Sure can.
So I'll be spending the next few slides giving a brief overview of the new PFAS rule as well as Region 9's voluntary PFAS program. So to start off, we'll begin with the rule. Oops. So here's a developmental timeline of the published PFAS rule. The decision you can see to write a rule started in 2021, and fast forward 3 years, and it was published, the final rule was published this year on April 26th. The rule applies to all community and non-transient, non-community water systems. However, there is a distinction between compliance monitoring for the rule and public notice requirements for the rule. While only systems with their own sources must sample under the new rule, all water systems must adhere to the public notice requirements, meaning a fully consecutive system does not need to sample for the rule. If a system has both their own sources and a consecutive connection, they are required to sample at any groundwater, surface water, or blended entry points. So for example, if a system has 3 entry points, entry point 1 being a consecutive connection, entry point 2 being connected to a groundwater well, and entry point 3 being a blend of a groundwater well and a consecutive connection source, then they would need to sample at both EP2 and EP3. Simple systems who are subject to the rule have until April 26, 2027 to conduct any initial monitoring samples and until April 26, 2029 to meet MCL compliance, MCL being the maximum contaminant level. This means only results above the MCL after April 26, 2029 will result in a violation, and the water system will need to conduct appropriate public notices at that time. So how do you know if you're within MCL compliance? The PFAS rule establishes MCLs for 5 PFAS analytes and a unitless hazard index for a blend of 4 PFAS analytes. The table here indicates that PFAS and PFOS MCLs are enforced to 2 significant figures, whereas the remaining 3 analytes and the hazard index are only enforced to 1 significant figure. MCL compliance is determined by using the running annual average, which is calculated with the unrounded values first and then rounded to get the compliance value. So for example, suppose a water system is on quarterly monitoring and has an unrounded RAA value of 4.06 ppt. Taking into consideration that the PFOA MCL is enforced to 2 significant figures, this number is then rounded up to 4.1 parts per trillion and would be considered within violation of the rule. Conversely, suppose they have a RAA of 4.04 ppt. This would round down to 4 parts per trillion and is in compliance. So now that we know how compliance is determined, what does this mean for your monitoring frequency? So here's a flowchart of the initial and compliance monitoring. I won't go into detail for the interest of time. However, I will give a brief summary. And as these slides are available to you, I highly encourage you to revisit this flowchart. So for the initial monitoring requirements, that's just going to be this section up here in the top left corner. The system source type and size, meaning how many customers they serve, determines how many initial monitoring sampling events that are required. Groundwater systems serving fewer than 10,000 customers need to conduct 2 sampling events 5 to 7 months apart, whereas surface water systems and any system serving greater than 10,000 customers need to sample 4 times 2 to 4 months apart. If any of these results have a detect for regulated analyte at or above the trigger level, which is half of the MCL, then, or they miss their initial monitoring requirement, then the system will start their compliance monitoring on a quarterly basis. Otherwise, the system will begin on triannual monitoring. After 2027, a system may be on quarterly, annual, or triannual compliance monitoring. Again, in the interest of time, I won't go into the details of how you actually go between the 3 types. Again, I encourage you to review this slide at your own time. But the main call out or highlight is that if a system does start on quarterly monitoring, it take up to 7 sampling events over the course of 4 years to even qualify for triannual monitoring. And that's because they need 4 consecutive quarters with results below the MCL, followed by 3 consecutive annual results below the trigger level. As a reminder, systems who do fail to conduct their initial monitoring requirements will automatically start on quarterly compliance. So violations for the new rule are issued if the system's RAA is greater than the MCL, or if a single result is greater than 4 times the MCL. So for instance, if you're on quarterly monitoring, then your RAA will be used to determine compliance. But if you're on annual or triannual monitoring, it will be the single result being greater than 4 times the MCL value. If you are in an exceedance or in violation, a Tier 2 PN must be issued to all customers. As mentioned before, compliance sampling only applies to community and NTNC systems with their own sources. But since all community and all NTNC systems must adhere to the PN rule, so for example, if a wholesaler learns of an MCL exceedance in their system, they must issue a PN to their customers as well as notify their purchasers. And then it's up to the consecutive system, or it's the responsibility of the consecutive system to then issue the PN to their own customers. And I forgot to call it out on the slide here, so I apologize, but waivers are not applicable under the new PFAS rule. So now that we've gone through a brief overview of the rule, I'll shift focus to Region 9's voluntary PFAS program. Region 9's PFAS sampling program started in 2021, and since then we have sampled at over 100 water systems. The program is voluntary and completely free to all Region 9 tribal water systems, meaning all materials, sampling, shipping, and analysis costs are covered by Region 9. Although this program started as simply an opportunity for systems to test for PFAS at their entry point and sources if they wanted, it has now become a great resource for systems to participate in to satisfy their initial monitoring requirements. As a reminder, systems who fail to conduct their initial monitoring will begin on compliance monitoring. I know I'm keep saying this, but I really do want to emphasize that point. We especially want to avoid this if possible, given that PFAS analysis can cost up to $300 to $800 per sample. The table on the right here outlines the general timeline for participating in our program and can give you a sense of what to expect as a participant. Taking into consideration the initial communication timelines, as well as coordinating with the lab and receiving the results, this can take up to 3 months. Knowing this and the initial monitoring frequency time, so again, those 2 samples 5 to 7 months apart, or 4 samples 2 to 4 months apart, we can see that this time can really add up. And although we have 2.5 years until April 26, 2027, I'm sure we're all aware just how quickly time can pass without us realizing. Here's a sampling plan for our program, which can give you an idea of the type of sampling events that would occur. Again, in the interest of time, I won't go into the flowchart in detail, but I do want to highlight some main points here. A, that we offer both entry point and source sampling for your first sampling event. And B, we encourage all water systems to conduct confirmation sampling in the event of a detection at or above a trigger level, since those results will impact your compliance monitoring frequency. And then lastly, C, that all participants must agree to conduct consumer notices in the event of confirmed detects above the MCL. And this is designed to mimic the PN rule that will go into effect starting April 2029. And then although, as a reminder, this program is voluntary and the MCL compliance date is not until April 26, 2029, so any exceedances before then will not result in a violation. So here's a summary slide of our program so far. In Region 9, there are 259 tribal water systems that are required to sample under the rule. 23 of those have already satisfied their initial monitoring requirements specifically through our program. And 94 of those will start on triannual monitoring. So I'm not sure if you're aware of the PFAS in your system, but it's not very common in Region 9, which is a good thing for us and for all of everyone's health. We'll also call out that systems who are selected for UCMR 5 can use those sampling events to satisfy initial monitoring requirements. However, there are 2 caveats to that, or 2 callouts. for that, and that is that UCMR 5 does not require systems serving greater than 10,000 to sample 4 times, whereas the PFAS rule does. And the second call out is that UCMR 5 is more lenient with their frequency requirements, while the rule is not. So for example, if a system is required to conduct 2 sampling events 5 to 7 months apart, and they collect that within 4 months apart, for UCMR 5, that may satisfy that rule or that regulation, those requirements. But for the rule, it would not, and they would need to sample a 3rd time. So I know I did give a brief overview of the PFAS rule and our program, but I do appreciate your time today, and do feel free to reach out to either myself or Ian after this talk with any questions you may have, or if you're interested in participating in our program. And I'll now hand it off to Ian, who will speak on available PFAS treatment options.
Thanks, Joy. So yeah, I'll talk a little bit about what options water systems have if they do have a PFAS hit. And so kind of one of the options, along with finding a new source or connecting to another water system, is treatment. And EPA has identified 4 best available treatment technologies that I have listed here, which are granular activated carbon, anion exchange resins, and nanofiltration and RO. And these involve removal, not destruction, and that's mostly because PFAS are highly stable and resistant to other methods of drinking water treatment, such as kind of the standard ones, coagulation, flocculation, and the other ones listed there. And so deciding which PFAS treatment you would want to select is very site specific, and it can depend on a number of factors, such as the one listed here, the PFAS type, whether it's short or long chain PFAS, and the concentration can affect which treatment you ultimately choose, as well as background water quality. Is the treatment that you're choosing also removing other contaminants in the water, or is it kind of competing with the PFAS for removal? Also, integration into the existing treatment facility, kind of the ease of integration can affect the treatment option, as well as waste and disposal considerations, and of course capital and O&M costs. And so I put a couple of resources here that I thought are pretty good for some background into looking at what PFAS treatment you would want to choose. ITRC, which is the Interstate Technology Regulatory Council, has a great website that kind of dives pretty deep into the options and other background on PFAS, as well as AWWA, which is American Water Works Association, has a PFAS treatment selection guide that is very useful. And so, yeah, if you do have concerns about PFAS in your drinking water, please reach out to your EPA drinking water program manager and we can work with you to look at a solution. And so now I'll pass it to Maddie to talk a little bit more about treatment.
Hi, everyone. So in addition to the resources that Ian mentioned, we developed a fact sheet to explore the trade-offs of each of the 4 PFAS treatment options, which you can access at this QR code, or we have printouts over there, and also at the water division table outside. So as Ian mentioned, treatment should really be considered after other options, including a new source, blending with existing or new sources, and connecting to another water system. So granular activated carbon, or GAC, and anion exchange are the most commonly used, as they are the most affordable, but reverse osmosis, or RO, and nanofiltration, or NF, can also be used and have higher PFAS removal rates, especially for short chain PFAS such as PFBS and GenX chemicals. So we developed diagrams of each of the treatment types to give you a general idea of how they work. So as you can see, GAC uses media that PFAS adsorbs or sticks to, and the media can be reactivated and reused. Anion exchange uses a charged resin that is selective for PFAS specifically. So Although there are resins that can be regenerated, single use are more recommended because regeneration processes are still being developed for PFAS. The resin has chloride ions, so when PFAS passes through, the chloride swaps with the PFAS. One of the downsides of GAC and anion exchange is that they should be run consistently to avoid fouling of the media and resin. Both aggressive backwashing and disinfection can damage the media or resin, so are not recommended to address fouling. Nanofiltration and reverse osmosis are similar in that they both use membranes to physically filter out PFAS. The nanofiltration membrane is temperature and pH dependent, so higher pH and higher temperature makes the pores bigger. And the RO membranes are even finer, so they remove the highest percentage of PFAS. However, nanofiltration and RO have higher rates of water rejection than GAC and anion exchange, so a percentage of the water will kind of bounce back and doesn't permeate the filtration membrane. The rejected water and removed PFAS mix to create what we call a brine. Therefore, nanofiltration and reverse osmosis are not as ideal where there's water scarcity. However, depending on PFAS levels, some systems can blend the brine with the treated water to achieve a higher rate of water production. The final rule does not require any specific destruction or disposal practices for waste residual containing PFAS. However, EPA suggests thermal reactivation for GAC, incineration for spent anion exchange resin, and disposal of RO or NF reject brine via a National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, or NPDES, compliant facility. Other disposal methods and specific residual types are listed in the fact sheet, as well as additional information about the 4 treatment types. And you can access that, again, via the QR code. If you look in Excel events, the slides are available, or it's also on our Region 9 PFAS sampling webpage, and then we have the printed copies here. So I also wanted to tell you about a new contract we have where tribes can request in-kind services for PFAS-related planning projects. So the EPA-directed contractor can conduct sampling, develop preliminary engineering reports or PERs, and develop planning documents to address PFAS in drinking water. While tribes can also be awarded a grant to do planning, this national contract provides an alternative where tribes do not have to manage a grant. Tribes can then use the PER developed by the contractor to support a project proposal for a construction grant, which can be utilized to construct treatment facilities if recommended by the PER. We also wanted to put in a plug to join EPA and RCAC at the Tribal Drinking Water Conference in April, where operators, water personnel, and TA providers will come together to learn from each other, network, and strengthen water operations in Region 9. It will be hosted April 21st to 24th, 2025 in Reno, Nevada. The theme this year is Make Every Connection Matter, chosen based off the collaborative work done by the tribes on the service line inventories and commemorating the first in-person event since 2018. Our agenda includes exciting sessions on operator skills like line break procedures and valve exercising, water math, and chemistry sessions to prepare for the operator exam, and funding sessions hosted by EPA and IHS. The sessions are eligible for CEUs, and ITCA will be hosting an operator exam at the end of the conference. We hope operators are able to take the exam, network with other operators in the region, and share their experiences and wealth of knowledge. So please take a photo of the slide or scan the QR code to register for the conference and for more information. We hope to see you there. And if you have any questions about that, please talk to Bela, Emma, and Sarah, who are organizing the conference. And then in addition to the printed PFAS fact sheets, we also have fact sheets for our other programs that we presented on. And so feel free to check those out after our session here or at the Water Division table. And here's our contact information for any follow-up questions, but we also welcome any questions now as well. Thank you.
Thank you. I just had one quick question. In all of the presentations, and we're talking about PFAS, are you working with the Bureau of Reclamation at the Brackish Groundwater National Desalination Research Facility under their water analysis? Because they're looking at PFAS in some treatments. And one of the things, I was in a presentation in a conference last week, and they talked about heat as a treatment, and they have found that the higher the heat, it kind of multiplies. It doesn't kill, so to speak, kill. I'm not a scientist, so I'm not using the scientific verbiage, but are you working with other agencies that are actually doing some of this treatment testing? And just wanted to say that.
I think some of my colleagues can speak to this too, but I don't think we're working directly with BOR, but we have ORD, our Office of Research and Development. Matt Small, or is Matt Small in region or? Okay. But yeah, we also have like national EPA working on this. So.
Thank you for bringing that up. That's really good for the audience to hear. I'll just clarify, our team really runs funding programs. So typically we would want the tribe to select, the treatment that they think is the best for them and suitable for them. But part of the reason we require a preliminary engineering report to fund any construction project and treatment is because we do want a fully scoped document. And ideally, that document would be developed, yes, by a stamped engineer, but also with the input of the operators who truly know their water system best. There's
Well, there are 4 best available technology treatments that they outlined in the presentation. And those are probably going to be the most common treatments that a small water system would pursue. I know our Office of Research and Development is also investigating other treatment technologies that may be more specialized and maybe maybe referring to the one you mentioned at BOR that look at that super high heating events where GAC or those 4 traditional technologies are not suitable for various environmental reasons. But I think in the tribal space we haven't encountered that yet, so we haven't gotten to to look at kind of where GAC or anti-exchange or RO doesn't work. That helps.
Oh my gosh. So PFAS is like coming from certain sources, like I think it's used as like a fire retardant on firefighters' PPE, as well as it's used in the foam that they spray over fire sections. So I'm wondering how like people can be like funded to not only like treat their waters, but identify sources where the contaminants are, and like how tribes can go about, I guess, working away from producers of PFAS, if even possible, because I know that it's used as like a fire retardant, which is very important.
I will just say the ECSDC program does fund source water protection activities. So right now our guidance sets any activities that are necessary to address PFAS. And if your utility determines they would like to address PFAS by identifying it at the source to mitigate and prevent, that could be an incorporated part of a preliminary engineering report and perhaps a consideration for O&M fees. With these programs and the projects that we fund, we want it to be functional for the tribe. The goal is that you can present us a document and say, hey, even though this might have a higher upfront cost, we have in the past funded projects where that's the case. It ultimately leads us to a lower O&M cost in the long run for the tribe, which is more sustainable. So I would encourage you, if you're interested in including that in your proposal, to go ahead and apply. That's for the ECSDC funding pool. So that's again for water systems that are serving 10,000 or fewer.
And then I'd also like to plug the Clean Water Indian Set-Aside Emerging Contaminant Program because non-point source pollution projects can be funded through this program, and any investigatory work, if you suspect that there's an EC in your wastewater, stormwater, surface water, that can be funded through that program as well.
Yeah, with the Clean Water Indian Set-Aside EC's program, you noted 1.6 million is what is being awarded every year.
Yeah, and we currently have 3.8 million available. So we have the money available if you have project proposals to submit right now.
And say if we're wanting to take the grant route instead of doing in-kind services or a contract with EPA, is there a cap as to what tribes can request?
No, there's no cap, but we have like estimates of how much maybe some projects might cost depending on whether they're planning or construction projects. But if it's project specific, you can come to us with the cost estimate for grants and interagency agreements. But I also wanted to clarify that for the in-kind services, you wouldn't need to provide that cost estimate because EPA would be coordinating that with our EPA directed contractor to figure that out.
And so we would provide the cost estimate, go on the grant route, but so you have cost estimates already kind of for some activities? Like we would want to monitor for 6 ppd quinone and PFAS. And I don't believe drinking water because we don't really have drinking water infrastructure for the tribe I work for, but we do a lot of surface water monitoring. So do you have estimates for the surface water monitoring?
We've gotten the project proposal that we received was for a surface water sampling program and a wastewater sampling program, and that was around 200,000, 250,000. So yeah, you can come to us with your cost estimate, and we can work with you on that as well. But there's no cap that we've defined.
Thank you.
I actually have just a really broad, oh, I'm sorry.
I just want to finish answering that question. So we don't have caps on how much we will fund, but for example, for sampling programs, we're thinking, between $2,000 and maybe $20,000, depending on like how many things you're sampling for, how many times you're sampling. So all those things depend. I would suggest if you aren't sure like how much sampling costs, like reach out to the lab that you work with on a regular basis and start asking about some of these things. And maybe, I don't know, maybe there's some help that our regional lab can provide if they're doing sampling already, as far as like what pricing is for each of these samplings, because it's going to depend on the contaminant you're sampling for, the amount you're sampling, and how long you want to sample for, if it's like a year or a 2-year project, depending on all of that. So we can help walk through that stuff with you. So just reach out to Amita or I. But yeah, I think the initial step might be reaching out to a lab that you're comfortable and that you've worked with before, and see if they have the capability to sample for some of, or to test for some of these things.
Shout out, Nancy.
Just a real quick question again. So I have, I'm the Native American Affairs Coordinator for Bureau of Reclamation in Temecula, but I have 31 tribes I work with. And 5 of my tribes are all in one area. Would it be advantageous for them to do one big grant because they are all on, and I'm putting it very 30,000 foot level here, but they're all on the same system that they get their water rights from? And so each tribe has a certain a certain amount of water that they get, but they have all the same issues. So would it be advantageous, instead of them competing against each other, because that's one thing that I have in my programs, try not to do, but they do have some uniqueness. But in this, what we're talking about, would that be, is that a good idea for them to look at it as a holistic, all 5 tribes, or go individually that they compete against each other?
That's a very good question. Thank you for asking that. And I think performing sampling in that way really emphasizes that community mindset that we need to be approaching these contaminants. I know recently we've had some conversations on the topic of whether or not we can fund consortiums of many tribes or just a tribe. My supervisor is, I think, a bit more close to those conversations, so I'll see if she has anything to offer.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, unfortunately, the way our grants work, we have a government-to-government relationship with a single single tribe. So I don't know that it would be advantageous to fund a single grant for sampling for multiple tribes. If the,
water authority that makes them as representative of those like 5 tribes, would they be able to do, would that water authority be able to go for that grant to cover all 5 tribes?
yeah, are we talking the Clean Water EC program? I'm guessing you're.
Like
Yeah.
a lot of several of these programs.
Yeah, our funding would have to go to a single tribe if it was via a grant. You know, another way to go about it might be looking at kind of some coordination among a group of tribes that were interested in similar sampling, and we could kind of work on a sampling plan that would benefit everybody. Our funding relationship via grants would be with a single tribe, but we could also look at in-kind services that could benefit multiple tribes if that's an option.
Specifically thinking of water technical assistance in a program that we've developed, I know there are some technical assistance providers that have a specific interest in wanting to work in large geographic areas, which may include multiple tribes. So I'll give you my card. I'd be happy to talk about that further.
I had a question. What's the most interesting proposal that you've seen for an emerging contaminant in wastewater? Pharmaceuticals?
We've only received one project proposal, or we've received 2. One was funded through other sources, but the one that we are funding through this program was addressing cyanotoxins and PFAS, like I mentioned in the presentation. Yeah.
This is an indirect answer, but during my PhD, I read a paper about pharmaceutical accumulation in a platypus. And per weight in the platypus's body, you know, a mammal, very similar to our body, it can respond similarly to our drugs. This platypus had 50% blood saturation of a dose of birth control from just being in its natural environment. And to think of the potential effect of that, you know, maybe 1 or 2 generations, they won't be able to produce. So when we're standing here talking about the importance of these funding opportunities, like we want to address these problems at the source. It is so much more than just our water system. That was, of course, not an application we received, but to ask a question, what's the most interesting thing you've seen? You know, interesting and terrifying sometimes have a fine line. We're riding a unicycle down the middle here, but we would really like to allocate these funds.
Sorry, one thing I just wanted to kind of clarify. I just realized what I said earlier. The tribe does have drinking water infrastructure, but not wastewater. Like we don't have a wastewater treatment plant that we're monitoring for 6-PBD quinone or PFAS or wastewater treatment plant in general. I just wanted to make that clarification. I was like, just realized what I said. Yeah.
Yeah, that's okay, because you don't have to be a wastewater utility for us to fund you through the Clean Water Needs Set Aside EC program.
All right, I think we're out of time, but I'm sure you all can go and ask them individual questions if you have more.
Thank you, everyone.